Hi, this is Debbie with Jewell's Custom Quilting. Today we're going to talk about a memory quilt for Maddie. This quilt behind me is a memory quilt for my friend's daughter. Maddie was 20 and realized something was wrong. By the time they got her to the doctor, they didn't think something was horribly wrong, but something was up. It was just a year of going to the doctors and seeking treatment and figuring out, insurance and that whole mess and entanglement, especially when you're going through something that's so emotional and then you have to have your wits about you. Just a heart-wrenching year. Madison passed away in 2019 from ovarian cancer. I'm over on the West Coast, and it's just far, and we could talk on the phone, but it's not like being there. I suggested to her that when she was ready to go ahead and start collecting some of her shirts, her t-shirts, her tops, something that I could just make I was thinking a traditional t-shirt quilt, with your t-shirts with the logos and places you've been, teams you were on, just getting a quilt together with the sashing around each of the t-shirt squares so that you could really have a good, sturdy, stable quilt, and something that would remind her, oh yeah, we went here and you were on this team and you liked horses and you did this with your friends or whatever. I got the t-shirts or the shirts of Maddie. I looked at them and they were tank tops. Only a couple had logos on them. It was thinner fabric, thinner t-shirt weave than I'm used to for making t-shirt quilts. And so I was kind of a little nervous, like, what am I going to do? To make this sturdy, kind of bring it together as a collection, a theme or a color or something. I just thought there's another way that I could get around that and pull this together. I'm going to be showing the fold and sew technique that I've used on another quilt, and I really enjoyed it. It was a baby quilt that I did probably about 6 or 7 years ago. I thought it's actually the perfect technique or way to put this together. I'm so thankful it's going to be able to be used by her family, in their family room, in their living room, on the couch when they're watching TV. It's perfect. So I'm really happy. Quilt history. We have written documentation from the 18 and 1900s that memorial quilts have been made in honor of loved ones. We also have oral history that goes back even further. Even though oral history seems like it can change from person to person, or maybe we miss something, or it's from someone else's perspective and how they saw it, it still is just as valuable as written documentation. Memory quilts are usually made out of clothing items from the person who has passed, and it could be their shirting, it could be a blouse, a house dress, childhood clothes, but anything that maybe they wore that reminds you of that person, regardless of the loss. When we have something that reminds us of them, it becomes sacred in a way, in that it is bringing us back to a memory when they were with us. I think it's an important and a valuable way to honor the person that's gone by taking the time to plan out and complete a memory quilt. And then you've got it for years. In the 1930s, my grandmother routinely would make utility quilts, and they weren't necessarily always memorial quilts, but they were quilts out of clothing, out of items that they had grown out of, or they'd get together with other other moms or other women and, you know, swap fabric that they had left over from a garment that had worn out, but the fabric is still good. You know, maybe the elbows or the knees are worn out, or there was a rip, but the rest of the fabric is good, and they repurposed that fabric to make quilts. I like how they were resourceful. The other thing that they did when they were making quilts out of clothing is my grandmother would save the buttons to do repairs or replacement or whatever, but she had always had a jar of buttons. The history is we've done this for hundreds of years, and even more so where it's been documented in the last 100 to 200 years where there's memory quilts made out of someone's garment. Supplies. So I knew I wanted to do the fold and sew method for this quilt. I had t-shirts that were thinner than I expected. I wanted to make sure this quilt was going to have the ability to have a long life. I really thought this is going to be a great method to make sure that my quilt was going to keep its shape, not get skewed. That's the one thing with t-shirt quilts, is hoping the long arm quilter will be able to bring it back into alignment, and it's really hard. I really like the fold and sew method, and that's what we're going to talk about next. The top fabric. I turned to the fold and sew instruction video that I've used before. It is from the National Quilters Circle, Fold and Sew Quilts with Peggy Sprandlin, Spradlin. So I'm probably mispronouncing Peggy's last name, but I don't mean to. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the description below. Her video has over 1 million views, and so that's telling me a lot of people have turned to that as a solution for them, or just to try out something new, because it doesn't have to be t-shirts that you're using. Actually, she's just using cotton, 100% cotton in her samples for this quilt. They are on the back side, your seams are encased. And so this is called French seam, and I didn't know that. So that was something new I learned. What was helpful at first was I cut out the front panel, and I just went ahead and just cut it out. And then I took my Pellon, and I use the Pellon P44F. I buy it in the bolt because I use a lot of it. And I also will have a link to the Pellon that I use. I save my 40% coupon and go down to my local national chain fabric store and buy the whole bolt. It's not, when you buy the bolt, it's just single. It's not, you know, like normally when we buy a bolt of fabric, it's folded over. This is not. It's just, I think it comes in, let's see, 20 inches, and then there's 48 yards on a bolt. So that's a lot. When I've got something going on, I just have it here. So I'm cutting out my t-shirt panel. I will take this, and on the bumpy side is, I think most of us know that, but that's where your stick is, and you're putting that down on the back panel of your t-shirt, and then you're going to press with your iron, not high heat. You need to test your fabric on the edges of this, you know, your t-shirt that's cut out on the back side. Just press maybe a medium high should be enough, but you're not rubbing, because then that's going to distort your t-shirt weaves, the cable stitch that's in it. You don't want that all distorted, so you're just going to be holding down and pressing and holding down and pressing, and you're just really trying to get the Pellon to hold that stable even if it's just for the assembly of your quilt square and your quilt, because we want that to be as stable as possible. Pretend that this is my square, your stabilizer on the back of them. I will go and just do all of mine, all of my t-shirts, cut them all, then go and iron stabilizer on all of them. Then I will cut them all out at once. That way I'm going to be consistent, and I'm not going to go, okay, was my inside square 10 inches or 12 inches, or do I add a half an inch for seam allowance, or what was I doing? Especially if I have to come back to the project. So I want to do all my squares at one time. I want to do all the ironing on of the interfacing. Then I'm getting my backing, and it's going to be bigger than the front. And Peg does a good job of showing exactly how to do that, but you want something that's going to complement the inside square for your outside square, because it's really just going to be another way of doing a sashing. What I did is, for this quilt, I put all my fat quarters in here, and I love 30s, 1930 reproduction, so this is where I'll either fold them up or fold them in squares, but I also have some other fat quarters or scraps that went well with Madison's quilt. And after I had all my inner squares of her shirts, then I found some kind of coordination fabric that would be a good frame around it. And I went ahead and folded, sewed my 1/4 inch, and then unfolded and ironed. And then once I made my whole stack, I double checked the measurement on all of the squares, and whichever square was the smallest, and I did have one that was smaller than everything else, even though I did everything in, oh, I've got thread. I did each step, everything for that step, and then everything for this step. I still had differences in sizes. That was discouraging, but I went ahead and resized all of the quilt squares to match the smallest one, because when I put it together, I need, as the project grows, for it all to fall into place and be the same size, not have my top quilt narrow and then I had fatter quilts that I had to work in, and then that's a nightmare. You just want to continually resize your quilts to make sure that they are being consistent. The inside t-shirt square was 12.5 inches, and the outside was 14.5 inches. So that the squares were a lot larger than if you had an 8-inch square and a 12-inch outside square. I would play around with grid paper, figure out what size. Do you want a twin? Do you want a lap quilt? Do you want a queen size quilt? And you decide what's going to make more sense for the fabric you have and for the size that you want to achieve when you're all done. And then just remember that there's a border. I ended up with a 6.5-inch border. It really framed in all of the squares and kind of brought it all together. One thing I'd like to say about the border, I usually try to, if the quilt has a lot of light colors, I'll go darker for my borders. But since this had so many bold, dark colors to it, the biggest thing is, if you're not sure, just lay out your fabric next to the quilt body and see what is going to be the best frame. Again, I'm an advocate for buying the bolt, but if you just want to buy some fabric because you like it and stash it away, do that. It's okay. The fabric I used on the back for this quilt, I'll go ahead and put a picture so that you can see how that looked. As I look for fabric and fabric deals and I find something that I like and I buy the bolt. I'm getting 5 to 5.5 yards of material for a quilt. I'm cutting that in half and seaming it down the middle. Here is like a sample bolt of fabric that's pretty generic, although it has these star bursts on them that I thought would be kind of fun and still neutral as a backing fabric. I have a couple bolts of wide width, and you know, if you save your 40% coupon or you find a good deal somewhere on wide width backing fabric that really draws you in and you're like, I can use that, then I would get that too. They're typically 96 to 103 inches wide. And then I think that you're still getting, let's see what the yardage is on this. You're still getting 15 yards on a bolt. If I've got a quilt that comes in that's, you know, a king size, and then I don't have a seam down the middle, but regardless, it's okay to put a seam down the middle, iron it. You don't want to iron your seam open. In garments, I think that we were taught in sewing class in school to iron your seams open when you're doing your backing or your quilting pieces. Don't iron them open. The only thing that's holding that together then is those stitches, and over the years those stitches are not protected and they're not going to last. So just iron your fabric, your middle seam to one side, iron the back, turn it around, iron it so that it's laying nice and flat. That is going to lay perfectly for whatever quilt project you're working on. So for this quilt, I chose to use bamboo batting. And actually, this is my roll. It is 50% bamboo, 50% cotton. It's not 100% bamboo because the cotton combination helps the fibers hold together and last the longest. I love bamboo batting. You can find that usually online or in your local fabric store. I buy this from my wholesaler, and I just love having it, and it's more practical for me to have a bolt of this on hand. I usually carry this or 100% cotton, and those are the ones that I go with. I do not use 100% polyester. I did years ago when I didn't know any better, but you don't want to use 100% lofty batting for your quilts. You either want 100% cotton. There are some 80-20s, which is 80% cotton, 20% polyester. And again, that polyester is in that to help hold the fibers together, because you don't want them balling up or falling apart. That's why the polyester is there. You just don't want to use 100% polyester. I would feel your batting and to make sure that that's the thickness you want. I used to use an 80-20 years ago with my quilting. I wasn't satisfied with the weight. I thought it was too light. If I'm paying for batting, I want there to be batting. The batting provides texture when you're stitching. Batting is important. So another thing that's important, if you're not bringing it to a long arm person and you're going to layer your quilt yourself, there is a right and a wrong side to batting. And I don't know if you can see, here's my label, but you can feel it for sure. One side's going to be soft and lofty. The other side is going to have a scrim, or almost like there was a hot iron that went over it just to kind of seal the fibers. That's the side that's going to go down. You're going to have your backing fabric. For me, it would be on my quilt frame, the backing fabric where the print is down and the wrong side is up. Then I'm going to put my batting, and the scrimmed side is going to go down. The lofty soft side is going to go up. The reason for this is if you take the soft side of the batting and that is down up against your back fabric, when the long arm stitching needle is stitching, it's going to be, with each stitch, it's going to be pushing the needle through the top fabric, the batting, the back fabric, and that soft fuzzy part is going to be poking through each stitch. And so you're going to have, you can have little white fuzz balls that will show up. So if you've got a back fabric that is dark or has some color to it, you can see some of that batting come through. Now it's going to correct itself with washing and with use. So if you've done that, or if you've noticed that that's how your quilt is, next time just go ahead and hopefully you'll remember this tip, that the scrim goes on the bottom and the fuzzy part goes on the top. Another way that long arm quilters will use to remind themselves, I went ahead and I had this card that I bought myself, because I ended up never using it, but I just thought it was pretty. It says, "Today may you find joy in unexpected places." I just kind of I like having that reminder. But the thing for the batting is dimples up, pimples down. So I'm going to find joy even when I mess up and don't do something correctly. And I'm going to hopefully do it correct the next time and learn from my mistakes. But I thought I would go ahead and add the little rhyme that long arm quilters will share with each other. Dimples up, pimples down. And what that means is dimples up when you're looking at the soft side compared to the back, it can look like little dimples. You can see the little dimples from the manufacturer when it was made. On the back side, it actually looks more like pimples, and so the pimples go down. That way, when it is being long arm stitched, the needle is not pushing the batting through the backing fabric and showing up as, you know, little fuzz balls. Quilt stitching. So I went ahead and turned my quilt around so that you could see the stitching without the pattern of the quilt. 95% of the quilt stitches I use come from one company that I really like supporting, and I love their stitching patterns. That is Sweet Dreams Quilt Studio by Kim Diamond. They're from Missouri. I have used her patterns since 2007, and I rarely deviate from what she has to offer. But with my Statler long arm quilting machine, I had an upgrade, and this program, or this pattern, was in my program upgrade. It's called Feathers, BLKPANT, by Judith Kraker, Kraker, and I'm going to put her link down below. I really liked this because it has swirls with the feathers. It almost looks like a 4-feathered pinwheel, and I didn't expect that because the way the pattern shows up, and I'll go ahead and put a photo of just the single pattern, and then also what it looks like when it is combined, a repeat pattern with repeat rows. So I'll put those pictures up here so you can kind of see when there's just one photo, you see these swirling feathers, and I really was drawn to that, but together the points turn into, when you have a repeated pattern, looks like a little pinwheel. And I loved that. I loved that for Madison. I chose a thread color. It's called Antique Gold. Can put a link to the company I use. It is Dallas Threads Textiles in Texas. So I'll go ahead and make sure that I put their link in. But I love this. This is one thing too that you're going to want to remember when you're trying to combine a stitch that's going to complement the quilt pattern. The quilt pattern, of course, is pretty blocky, and you want to soften that with the stitch. Your stitch pattern should never overpower what has been pieced together. They're supposed to complement and then maybe kind of tone down the straight lines, give it more of a soft, kinder edge to the front. Whenever you're choosing a stitch and you're talking to your long arm quilter, or if you're doing that yourself, when your pattern, your pieced quilt pattern has a lot of straight edges, you want to choose something that has a stitch pattern that has more curves. So you're doing the opposite. That way it complements. You never want your stitching to overpower and take away from the piecing that's been done in front. I think that this feather pattern, stitching pattern, complements the front well, but I just wanted to turn it around and show you what the overall looks like. I'm pretty happy with it. Binding. So for this pattern, I still have the quilt turned around so you can see the stitching. If you get real close, there's just a little faint swirl to the backing fabric. And the front, if you remember, has the white borders with the floating leaf and flowers in the different colors. So it's a lighter fabric, and I wanted just to go dark with the ending, the binding that went all the way around. This has ginkgo patterns, ginkgo leaves, and it still has the swirl with it. Even though your binding is so small, I still wanted this pattern to show up, so I chose something that was also had a smaller leaf to it. I will make my own binding. I cut my binding strips 3.5 inches. I'm going to include the binding tutorial from Missouri Star Quilt Company. She makes it simple, and that you combine the start and the ending point, and she gives you a foolproof, because I need a foolproof solution to how I am starting and stopping my quilt binding. Cut your 3.5 strips. You connect those strips together to make sure that you've got long enough binding to go out all the way around your quilt. I fold that in half and iron a good seam there. You're taking your binding and sewing to the front. You're going to flip the binding to the back, and you're hand sewing that blind stitch. That way, when you're weaving your blind stitch and get a good chunk of weaving of your fabric with the needle, and then always look to make sure that your needle didn't go through to the front of the quilt. You don't want your blind stitch to be seen, and that means on the front as well. I really liked this project. I'm so thankful to be done with it, because I have so many more projects that I'm in the middle of and I need to finish. I'm glad that you watched this with me today. You were with me and followed all the steps. I'm sure that you have a project that you can either start planning for or that you can finish, and I want to encourage you to do that. My biggest hope for you is that you complete your projects, bring them to completion. Quilt It Done with Debbie.